Hello, and welcome to Victorian Story Hour. I am your host, the Storyteller. Tonight, in honor of the holiday, we have a selection of tales and poems from the Emerald Isles. But first, a toast to absent friends. We begin tonight with a tale of a priest, but not the one you may be thinking. Ours was not a teacher of lessons, but one who had to learn them. The Priest's Soul, as collected by Lady Wilde, the mother of our beloved Oscar. In former days, there were great schools in Ireland, where every sort of learning was taught to the people, and even the poorest had more knowledge at that time than many a gentleman has now. But as to the priests, their learning was above all, so that the fame of Ireland went over the whole world, and many kings from foreign lands used to send their sons all the way to Ireland to be brought up in the Irish schools. Now, at this time, there was a little boy learning at one of them who was a wonder to everyone for his cleverness. His parents were only laboring people, and of course poor. But young as he was, and as poor as he was, no king's or lord's son could come up to him in learning. Even the masters were put to shame, for when they were trying to teach him, he would tell them something they never heard of, and show them their ignorance. One of his greatest triumphs was in argument, and he would go on till he proved to you that black was white, and then, when you gave in, for no one could beat him in talk, he would turn round and show you that white was black, or maybe that there was no color at all in the world. When he grew up, his poor father and mother were so proud of him that they resolved to make him a priest, which they did at last, though they nearly starved themselves to get the money. Well, such another learned man was not in Ireland, and he was as great in argument as ever, so that no one could stand before him. Even the bishops tried to talk to him, but he showed them at once that they knew nothing at all. Now, there were no schoolmasters in those times, but it was the priests taught the people. And as this man was the cleverest in Ireland, all the foreign kings sent their sons to him, as long as he had house room to give them. So he grew very proud, and began to forget how low he had been, and worst of all, even to forget God, who had made him what he was. And the pride of arguing got hold of him, so that from one thing to another he went on to prove that there was no purgatory, and then no hell, and then no heaven, and then no God, and at last that men had no souls, but were no more than a dog or a cow, and when they died, there was an end of them. "Whoever saw a soul," he said, "if you can show me one, I will believe." No one could make any answer to this. And at last they all came to believe that as there was no other world, everyone might do what they liked in this. The priest setting the example, for he took a beautiful young girl to wife. But as no priest or bishop in the whole land could be got to marry them, he was obliged to read the service over for himself. It was a great scandal, yet no one dared to say a word, for all the king's sons were on his side, and would have slaughtered anyone who tried to prevent his wicked goings-on. Poor boys. They all believed in him, and thought every word he said was the truth. In this way, his notions began to spread about, and the whole world was going to the bad when one night an angel came down from heaven and told the priest he had but 24 hours to live. He began to tremble and asked for a little more time, but the angel was stiff and told him that could not be. "What do you want time for, you sinner?" he asked. "Oh, sir, have pity on my poor soul," urged the priest. "Oh, no. You have a soul, then," said the angel. "Pray, how did you find that out?" "It has been fluttering me ever since you appeared," answered the priest. "What a fool I was not to think of it before." "A fool, indeed," said the angel. "What good was all your learning when it could not tell you that you had a soul?" "Ah, my lord," said the priest, "if I am to die, tell me how soon I may be in heaven." "Never," replied the angel. "You denied there was a heaven." "Then, my lord, may I go to purgatory?" "You denied purgatory also. You must go straight to hell," said the angel. "But, my lord, I denied hell also," answered the priest. "So you can't send me there either." The angel was a little puzzled. "Well," said he, "I'll tell you what I can do for you. You may either live now on earth for 100 years, enjoying every pleasure, and then be cast into hell forever. Or you may die in 24 hours in the most horrible torments, and pass through purgatory, there to remain till the day of judgment, if only you can find some one person that believes, and through his belief mercy will be vouchsafed to you, and your soul will be saved." The priest did not take 5 minutes to make up his mind. "I will have death in 24 hours, he said, "so that my soul may be saved at last." On this, the angel gave him directions as to what to do and left him. Then, immediately, the priest entered the large room where all the scholars and the king's sons were seated, and called out to them, "Now, tell me the truth, and let none fear to contradict me. Tell me, what is your belief? Have men souls?" "Master," they answered, "once we believed that men had souls, but thanks to your teaching, we believe so no longer. There is no hell, and no heaven, and no God. This is our belief, for it is thus you taught us." Then the priest grew pale with fear and cried out, "Listen! I taught you to lie. There is a God, and man has an immortal soul. I believe now all I denied before." But the shouts of laughter that rose up drowned the priest's voice, for they thought he was trying them for argument. "Prove it, master," they cried. "Prove it! Who has ever seen God? Who has ever seen a soul?" And the room was stirred with their laughter. The priest stood up to answer them, but no word could he utter. All his eloquence, all his powers of argument had gone from him, and he could do nothing but wring his hands and cry out, "There is a God! There is a God! Lord, have mercy on my soul!" And they all began to mock him and repeat his own words that he had taught them. "Show him to us! Show us your God!" And he fled from them, groaning with agony, for he saw that none believed. And how then could his soul be saved? But he thought next of his wife. "She will believe," he said to himself. "Women never give up God." And he went to her. and she told him that she believed only what he taught her, and that a good wife should believe in her husband first, and before and above all things in heaven and earth. Then despair came on him, and he rushed from the house, and began to ask everyone he met if they believed. But the same answer came from one and all: "We believe only what you have taught us." For his doctrine had spread far and wide through the country. Then he grew half mad with fear, for the hours were passing, and he flung himself down on the ground in a lonesome spot, and wept and groaned in terror, for the time was coming fast when he must die. Just then, a little child came by. "God save you kindly," said the child to him. The priest started up. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. "I have come from a far country to learn about him," said the child. "Will your honor direct me to the best school they have in these parts?" "The best school and the best teacher is close by," said the priest, and he named himself. "Oh, not to that man," answered the child, "for I am told he denies God, and heaven, and hell, and even that man has a soul, because he cannot see it. But I would soon put him down." The priest looked at him earnestly. "How?" he asked. "Why," said the child, "I would ask him if he believed he had life to show me his life." "But he could not do that, my child," said the priest. "Life cannot be seen. We have it, but it is invisible." "Then if we have life, though we cannot see it, we may also have a soul, though it is invisible," answered the child. When the priest heard him speak these words, he fell down on his knees before him, weeping for joy, for now he knew his soul was safe. He had met one at last that believed. And he told the child his whole story, all his wickedness and pride and blasphemy against the great God, and how the angel had come to him and told him of the only way in which he could be saved, through the faith and prayers of someone that believed. "Now then," he said to the child, "take this penknife and strike it into my breast, and go on stabbing the flesh until you see the paleness of death on my face. Then watch, for a living thing will soar up from my body as I die, and you will then know that my soul has ascended to the presence of God. And when you see this thing, make haste and run to my school and call on all my scholars to come and see that the soul of their master has left the body, and that all he taught them was a lie. For that there is a God who punishes sin, and a heaven and a hell, and that man has an immortal soul, destined for eternal happiness or misery." "I will pray," said the child, "to have courage to do this work." And he kneeled down and prayed. Then when he rose up, he took the penknife and struck it into the priest's heart, and struck again, till all the flesh was lacerated. But still the priest lived, though the agony was horrible, for he could not die until the 24 hours had expired. At last, the agony seemed to cease, and the stillness of death settled on his face. Then the child, who was watching, saw a beautiful living creature, with 4 snow-white wings, mount from the dead man's body into the air and go fluttering around his head. So he ran to bring the scholars, and when they saw it, they all knew it was the soul of their master, and they watched with wonder and awe until it passed from sight into the clouds. And this was the first butterfly that was ever seen in Ireland. And now all men know that the butterflies are the souls of the dead, waiting for the moment when they may enter purgatory and so pass through torture to purification and peace. But the schools of Ireland were quite deserted after that time, for people said, "What is the use of going so far to learn when the wisest man in all Ireland did not know if he had a soul till he was near losing it, and was only saved at last through the simple belief of a little child." Pride can be a dangerous thing. And this priest needed reminding that some things must simply be taken on faith. Next, we turn to tales of the good folk. First, a poem about a leprechaun. The Leprechaun, or Fairy Shoemaker, as related by William Allingham. Little cowboy, what have you heard? Up on the lonely Rath's green mound. Only the plaintive yellow bird, sighing in sultry fields around. Cherry, 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 chee-hee! Only the grasshopper and the bee? Tip-tap, rip-rap, tick-a-tack-too. Scarlet leather, sewn together, this will make a shoe. Left, right, pull it tight, summer days are warm. Underground in winter, laughing at the storm. Lay your ear close to the hill. Do you not catch the tiny clamor? Busy click of an elfin hammer. Voice of the leprechaun singing shrill as he merrily plies his trade. He's a span and a quarter in height. Get him in sight, hold him tight, and you're a made man. You watch your cattle the summer day, sup on potatoes, sleep in hay. How would you like to roll in your carriage, look for a duchess's daughter in marriage? Seize the shoemaker, then you may. Big boots a-huntin', sandals in the hall, white for a wedding feast, pink for a ball. This way, that way, so we make a shoe, getting rich every stitch, tic-tac-too. 99 treasure crocks this keen miser fairy hath, hid in mountains, wood and rocks, ruin and round tower, cave and rath, and where the cormorants build. From times of old, guarded by him, each of them filled, full to the brim, with gold. I caught him at work one day myself, in the castle ditch, where foxglove grows, a wrinkled, wizened, and bearded elf, spectacles stuck on his pointed nose, silver buckles to his hose, leather apron, shoe in his lap, rip-rap, tip-tack, tic-tac-too. A grasshopper on my cap, away the moth flew. Buskins for a fairy prince, brogues for his son. Pay me well when the job is done. The rogue was mine beyond a doubt. I stared at him, he stared at me. Servant, sir, humph, says he, and pulled a snuff-box out. He took a long pinch, looked better pleased. The queer little leprechaun offered the box with a whimsical grace. Poof! He flung the dust in my face, and while I sneezed, was gone. The good folk can be quite clever, and big folk, like us, trouble them at our own risk. Now, I would like to change for just a moment and share with you some poetry from a beloved daughter of Ireland. And so now, a few poems from Eavan, Boland. The first, that the science of cartography is limited, and not simply by the fact that this shading of forest cannot show the fragrance of balsam, the gloom of cypresses, is what I wish to prove. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of Connaught and entered a wood there. Look down, you said, this was once a famine road. I looked down at the ivy and the scotch grass, rough-cut stone had disappeared into, as you told me, in the second winter of their ordeal in 1847, when the crop had failed twice. Relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. Where they died, there the road ended. And ends still, and when I take down the map of this island, it is never so I can say, here is the masterful, the apt rendering of the spherical as flat, nor an ingenious design which persuades a curve into a plane. But to tell myself again that the line which says woodland and cries hunger and gives out amongst sweet pine and cypress and finds no horizon will not be there. The second, the Dolls Museum in Dublin. The wounds are terrible. The paint is old. The cracks along the lips and on the cheeks cannot be fixed. The cotton lawn is soiled. The arms are ivory dissolved to wax. Recall the quadrille, hum the waltz, promenade on the yacht club terraces. Put back the lamps in their copper holders, the carriage wheels on the cobbled quays, and recreate Easter in Dublin. Booted officers, their mistresses, sunlight criss-crossing college green, steam hissing from the flanks of horses. Here they are, cradled and cleaned, held close in the arms of their owners, their cold hands clasped by warm hands, their faces memorized like perfect manners. The altars are mannerly with linen, the lilies are whiter than surplices. The candles are burning and warning. Rejoice, they whisper, after sacrifice. Horse chestnuts hold up their candles. The green is vivid with parasols. Sunlight is pastel and windless. The bar of the Shelburne is full. laughter and gossip on the terraces, rumor and alarm in the barracks. The Empire is summoning its officers. The carriages are turning. They are turning back, past children walking with governesses, looking down, cosseting their dolls, then looking up as the carriage passes, the shadow chilling them. Twilight falls. It is twilight in the Dolls' Museum. Shadows remain on the parchment-colored wastes. Our bruises on the stitched cotton clothes are hidden in the dimples on the wrist. The eyes are wide. They cannot address the helplessness which has lingered in the airless piece of each glass case. To have survived, to have been stronger than a moment, to be the hostages ignorance takes from time and ornament from destiny. Both. To be the present of the past. To infer the difference with a terrible stare, but not feel it and not know it. Finally, the lost land. I have 2 daughters. They are all I ever wanted from the earth, or almost all. I also wanted one piece of ground, one city trapped by hills, one urban river, an island in its element. So I could say mine, my own, and mean it. Now they are grown up and far away. And memory itself has become an emigrant, wandering in a place where love dissembles itself as landscape, where the hills are the color of child's eyes, where my children are distances, horizons. At night, on the edge of sleep, I can see the shore of Dublin Bay, its rocky sweep and its granite pier. Is this, I say, how they must have seen it? Backing out on the mailboat at twilight, shadows falling on everything they had to leave and would love forever. And then I imagined myself at the landward rail of that boat, searching for the last sight of a hand. I see myself on the underworld side of that water, the darkness coming in fast, saying all the names I know for a lost land. Ireland, absence, daughters. It is worth remembering that the history of Ireland is not always a pretty one. And that while we are shaped of tales of joy, we are also shaped by tales of sorrow and loss. It is that complexity of experience that we must embrace to truly understand where a people come from. I would like now to turn to a tale of a man who wandered a bit far afield and got more than he bargained for. This is the Faery Host. The silence of the night was broken by the sharp ringing steps of a late traveller on the frost-rimmed road. The young man tucked his head down deeper into his collar and pushed his hands into his pockets, feeling the chill bite through the thin cloth. It was a bitter night, and a full moon sparkled on the road, etching it in silver, the harsh light adding to the chill. He stopped and pulled a hip flask from his back pocket. The locally brewed liquor burned its way down his throat and settled in his stomach like hot coals, and the fumes made him pleasantly unaware of the lateness of the hour or the lonely road he traveled. He had been humming the refrain of an air the piper had played back in the town for some time when he became aware that his voice was not the only one on the road that night. He stopped and listened. And there, sharp and clear, in the distance he could hear voices raised in laughter and song, with the thin skirl of the pipes and the delicate tracery of a harp hanging in the air. The young man leaned on the hedge that bordered the road and stared across the field. But he could see nothing, and the night was so clear that the sounds could have traveled some distance. But his curiosity had been aroused, and ignoring all the tales the country folk told of this part of the West, and the warnings never to leave the road, especially at the full moon, he vaulted the hedge and set out across the frozen fields toward the sounds. The fields, he knew, were part of the estate of O'Donnell, the local landlord, an evil man with a dark reputation, a man of whom it was said bore an uncanny resemblance to both his father and grandfather. The young man stumbled and fell on the hard earth. He groaned aloud and then screamed as a hand came out of the night and helped him to his feet. He cowered back and stared up at the stranger. No, not a stranger. Someone familiar. He shook his head, trying to clear the fumes and dizziness that made his senses swim. "You are Colum McMahon," stated the stranger. The young man nodded dumbly, and then recognition dawned. "You are the O'Donnell," he whispered, and unconsciously crossed himself. "Why are you trespassing on my land?" "I heard the music and singing, sir, and I just followed it." The O'Donnell smiled, and Colum shivered, for it gave his face a skull-like appearance in the bleached moonlight. He recalled the stories whispered about this man, and especially the one which said that he had traded his soul and humanity for communication with the elder gods and spirits that once walked the land. "Why then," O'Donnell said, "let us find the source of this merriment." He gripped Colum by the hand, and the young man winced and would have pulled away if he could, for although the night was chill, the man's hand was even colder. The O'Donnell hurried across the fields, his footing sure and certain, never stumbling nor falling, dragging Colum behind him. And if he had not been gripped so tightly, the young man would have believed he followed a wraith, for the man made no more sound than blown smoke, and was almost as visible. He was clad all in black, from his high-collared jacket to his black hose, and save for the silver buckles on his shoes and the silver buttons that glittered like tiny stars on his jacket, he would have been invisible. They marched across field after field, pushing through frozen hedgerows and ice-sheathed rivers and streams. Several times, Colum tried to strike up a conversation with the dark figure before him, but his words hung, forced and empty, on the cold air, and the O'Donnell did not deign to reply. Eventually, they topped a rise and found themselves looking down into a hollow. The depression must have been almost a half-mile across, topped on three sides by trees and low bushes. The silver thread of a stream cut across from the left and vanished into the night. And although it was dark in the hollow, Colum could see vague forms moving to and fro. The O'Donnell pointed down. "There is the source of your music and laughter. They dance within." Colum strained, but the sounds were still as distant as ever, and who were they? He turned back to the older man, but he was gone, vanished into the night whence he came. The young man backed away from the hollow, fully intending to turn and run when he could bear to have the sounds at his back. But suddenly, there was movement in the hollow, and two figures loomed up out of the shadows. They were smaller than he, and clad in somber colors of a peculiar cloth, which reflected the moonlight like oiled silk. Their features were thin and pointed, their eyes slanted upwards, and seemed split-pupilled, like a cat's. Their hands, when they reached for him, were long and thin, with delicate, graceful fingers and overlong nails. Taking him by the hands, they drew the young man down into the hollow. It was as if he were walking under water. All sounds ceased and were replaced with a muffled pounding, like the surf on the sands, and which, he abruptly realized, was the pounding of his own heart. Familiar objects, even the trees, took on grotesque and fantastic shapes. Tiny faces seemed to leer at him from their bowls, and feral eyes gleamed in the depths of the bushes. Tendrils of white mist, which he had not seen from above, now drifted past his face, carrying the acrid odor of crushed herbs and unfamiliar spices. Colum tried to talk to the two creatures who were leading him into an unfamiliar world, but although he could form the words, they came out strange and garbled. The fear and terror he had felt was fading now, and the urgency to be away from this place seemed unimaginably distant and unimportant. He felt himself slipping into an easy acceptance of the unreal situation. It was as if he were wandering through a dream, but at some deep, almost unconscious level, he realized that this was no dream. The fog thickened as they moved down into the hollow, and then it abruptly disappeared. Colum looked around in dull confusion. The hollow seemed larger than he had first imagined it to be. It now stretched away to misty horizons. Buildings shimmered in the distance, and the pale silver ball of the moon overhead now glowed with a wan golden light, like a morning sun. And the Faery Host had gathered. They thronged the hollow in a colorful, murmuring mass, like a great swarm of insects. Many were like the two leading column, thin, high-featured elven creatures, dressed in shimmering garments which whispered together when they moved. There were others, small, gnarled, crooked creatures that seemed neither man nor beast. Tiny creatures, no longer than his hand, who flew on huge butterfly wings. And there were small, but perfectly formed men, clad in rough clothes of red, green, and brown. Some bowed mockingly to the young man as he was led through the mass, whilst others either ignored him or looked pityingly on him. And the low susurration of voices stilled as he passed, and the throng backed away on either side, leaving an avenue down which he must pass. Facing him at the end, seated upon a cloth-draped tree stump, was a man, crowned like a king and clad in lord's finery. Colum stood before the elven lord and stared deep into his colorless eyes. He felt he could drown in them. They were so empty. The king rose, and he was a head taller than the young man, and placed a long-fingered hand on his trembling shoulder. "I am Eavan, lord of the elven folk." The company murmured their lord's name as if in benediction. "You are welcome to this gathering, son of man," he gestured about with his right hand. "Enjoy," he commanded, and resumed his seat. The young man was grabbed by two of the elven maids and dragged into the whirling crowd. The fairy music began again. Two harpers, their instruments the most beautiful and delicate Colum had ever seen, and a piper caressing an instrument which looked impossibly old. The music inflamed him. It was so wild and free, almost alive, not like the poor shadow of sound that passed for music in where? The faint echo of an air haunted the dim recesses of his mind. He groped for it with blind fingers, suddenly realizing that it was of immeasurable importance to him. One of the elven maids pressed a goblet of purest silver into his hands and urged him to drink. He raised it to his lips, and the potent vapors made his head swim. But some primal warning urged him not to drink. No, nor eat the food of fairy. He worked his throat, but handed the maid back the goblet untasted. He refused all food, pretending to be chewing when someone offered him a delicacy. He danced with many elven maids, whirling around and around in a mad swirling that left him dizzy and gasping. Many of the fairy folk seemed to want to touch him, as if he were some token or charm, and one, an old woman, no taller than his waist, wept as she kissed his hand. That night, if night it was, passed swiftly, and as the dawn tinged the eastern sky with pale light, the tiny lanterns were extinguished, and one by one the fairy folk disappeared back into whatever time or place they inhabited. And as they did, the golden moon sun faded from the skies and sank into the west. The trees and stones ceased to stare, and the sounds and smells of fairy faded, leaving only the mundane behind. Colum stared suddenly. He had been staring into the eastern sky, welcoming and yet regretting the coming dawn, when someone touched his shoulder. It was Eavan, the Elven Lord. "You have cheated us, son of man." "I don't understand." Eavan gestured to the east. "The dawn is almost upon us. The fairy folk are gone, and by rights you should have gone with them." "But why?" wondered Colin. "Why? Because you were part of a tribute paid to us by the one you know as the O'Donnell." "What tribute?" "The soul of a baptized follower of the new God, the one you call the Christ. In return, we extend the life of the O'Donnell." "How old is he?" Colin asked suddenly. "As we reckon time, 4 nights. You were to pay for that 4th night, but you cheated us, for you neither ate our food nor drank our wines, and thus we have no claim on you." 4 nights is not a long time, said Colin. "Time, as we measure it," said the Elven Lord, "differs greatly from your measurement of it. Look," he pointed into the east. "The sun arises. I must depart. I wish you well, although I pity you, and soon you will wish you had followed us beyond this world, into the Shadowlands, the realm of Fairy. Farewell." Eavan, the lord of the elven folk, moved across the hollow towards the west, and as he did so, a shadowy figure stepped from behind a tree and joined him. And Colin could have sworn it was the O'Donnell. Then they were gone. The road back to the village was wrong. It was not something he could describe, more of an overall impression. He had traveled that road for as long as he could remember. He knew every stone and crack in its rough surface, every tree and bush that lined the winding way, and every lichen-covered wall. But now they were different. Perhaps the road seemed wider, the bushes and trees just a little bigger, a little more unkempt than he remembered them. He noticed new bushes and young trees which, he felt sure, had not been there the night before. And there were also gaps where he knew there ought to be a certain bush or low wall. He began to run. The sun came up, and his dew-soaked clothes steamed in the hot summer air. Hot summer air. But it had been the depths of winter only last night. Filled with a mind-numbing fear, Colin fled towards the village. Everything on the road was so familiar and yet so strange, so old and yet so new. The village was much as he remembered it. Perhaps the buildings a little more dilapidated and the church slightly more decrepit, but that gilt cross on the steeple was new, and it had not been there last night. The inn was almost unchanged, save that the roof had been recently thatched. All conversation ceased as he entered its familiar dark, low-ceilinged interior, redolent with the heavy odors of strong spirits, stale beer, and sweat. Colin nodded to a score of faces he knew, or thought he knew, but they merely looked puzzled and were slow to return his greeting. He ordered a glass of dark beer and lounged back against the smooth wood of the bar. The locals, their scrutiny of the stranger finished, and apparently satisfied that he was one of themselves, turned their attention back to the old man in the corner by the turf fire. His voice was rough, for it had been a long night's storytelling, and it was only now coming to an end. He sipped from a heavy mug and resumed. from this very spot it was. And sure wasn't it my father, God rest him, who saw him. Out he went, and with a few jars inside him, for it was a bitter night, and cold enough to crack the stones, and he took the old straight road home. The storyteller paused and sipped his drink, but he never reached it. Oh, there was a search made, of course, but sure, he was gone, and there was little to be done about it. But, and the old man paused for effect, they found a scrap of cloth torn from his coat, just above the fairy dell in the O'Donnell's land. The fairies got him. And who was he, and how long ago was this? Colum asked into the silence. Sure, and wasn't he a local lad, Colum McMahon, and it's nigh on 100 years since he went with the Faery Host. As they say, time is relative. Now, to conclude this evening, I would like to tell you another tale of a leprechaun. Here, hold your whist now, and let me tell you about the only time one of the big folk ever laid his hand on me. Seamus Ban, the old leprechaun, adjusted the tiny spectacles on his nose and looked solemnly at the Lepracaun and Fairytale gathered around the blazing fire. Carefully, Seamus straightened his legs, the joints cracking and popping like dried wood. Ah, he sighed. It's pure murder sitting with the old legs folded under you all day, and me with the rheumatics, something terrible. One of the Fairytale pushed his red cap back onto his head and opened his mouth to reply, but then, catching the glint in the old leprechaun's eye, shut up and said nothing. I must have been just a slip of a lad, but even then I was the best cobbler in all of Ireland. Look! And he lifted up one of his foot. I made these myself about that time. Dutifully, the Leprechaun and Fairytale admired the tiny black boots with their huge silver buckles. 'Twas early morning, he continued, and I was sitting under the oak tree down by the streams that run through Dillon's farm. I had a fine pair of brogues that needed eels, and I was tapping away, at peace with myself and at home with the world. He stopped and filled a long briar pipe with pungent tobacco. Now, he puffed vigorously until the bowl glowed cherry red. Now, there it was, and not a soul about, so I thought, and not a sound on the air, save the chirping of the birds and the ringing of my hammer. It was a morning to bring a smile to your lips and a song to your heart. He paused for effect. Suddenly, I was pounced upon and held by one of the big folk. He paused again, and his audience murmured appreciatively. And weren't you afraid? Asked the Leprechaun, sipping some of the clear whiskey. Ah, no, sure don't we all know that the big folk are just plain stupid. Several heads were nodded wisely, and one nodded so vigorously that he banged his head against the wall of the ruined barn where they were meeting and fell down stunned. He was a giant of a man, continued Seamus. He was easily 3 times my height, with arms on him that could strangle an ox. He was dressed in drab and colourless garments. Unconsciously, the leprechaun touched his own gold-embroidered red waistcoat. And over his shoulder hung a basket. A poacher? Asked the Leprechaun. Aye, that's what he sure was, and that's what he was, sure enough. There was a brace of rabbits and a line of fish in that basket, I shouldn't wonder. Well, he hugged me, fair and square, and with a greedy look in his eye, he asks, Your pot of gold, where is it, little man? No tricks now, or I'll use you as fish bait. Of course, I pretended ignorance, but he wouldn't be put off, and at last I was forced to relent, but only after he'd held me out over the river and promised to drop me in tied to a stone. The leprechaun nodded gravely at the frightened whispers that ran around the assembly. And it's true, not a word of it a lie. What did you do? Well, I'd very little choice, for he didn't take his eyes off me for an instant, and so I led him over the bridge and up towards the quarries. I'll tell you, it was a merry dance I led him, like a horse. Merry dance I led him for most of the morning. By midday, he was sweating like a horse and smelling like a pig. The leprechaun paused to relight his pipe. But in the end, there was nothing for it, and I had to bring him to the far end of the quarry. That's there, I said, and pointed to a flat stone. Well, he lifted and tugged and pulled until he was fit to burst, but he couldn't move the stone, and at last declared that he needed a pick and shovel. And what about me? I asked. There's not much I can do for you now. Oh, be off with you, says he. Well, as soon as I disappeared, he starts looking round for something to mark the stone with. For if you recall, that end of the quarry is floored with a good many flat stones. And at last he takes up a piece of flint and cuts a cross in the rock. And off he goes in search of a pick and shovel. Seamus Ban tapped the ashes out of his pipe and finished the dregs of whiskey in his glass, and then stood up and made ready to go. And what happened? Did he get your treasure? Where are you going? The old leprechaun looked disgusted. Of course he didn't get my treasure. All he got was trouble. Sure, as soon as he was gone, I crept back and cut a cross into all the stones at the end of the quarry. Well, as he says, sometimes big folk are just plain stupid. And on that note, we shall call it an end to the night. I am, as always, your host, the Storyteller. May your glasses always be full and your shelves filled with books yet unread. Until next time, I bid you good night.